Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our next session on the Try It boxes by Faber-Castell. This is the Creative Studio, and today we're going to be looking at the dry mediums. So I have graphite pencils, color pencils, fixed point ink pen, and graphite pencils, pastels. So we got a lot to look at and a lot to go through. What I'm going to do is take each one of our materials and go over some of their characteristics, and then pretty much just focus on how to use the tool and what their specific qualities are. And then for part two, which will be in a couple of weeks, we will actually take all that information together and do kind of a specific drawing that you can follow along with. So let's go to the overhead camera here so we can see what we've got in our boxes. All right, this is the Try It box for the dry mediums. You'll get a nice little kind of newspaper broadside sheet. It'll give you a little bit of information about the Faber-Castell company, their sustainable forestry programs, and a lot of the things that they do to make sure that their materials are part of a sustainable system. They do a lot of reforesting. They have wildlife refuges for endangered species, and they really are very concerned about ecology as well as putting together very high quality premium products. So you'll get a lot of kind of interesting information about the company there. And here are what we're going to be working with. We've got soft pastels, we have color pencils, we have graphite pencils, a paper stomp that will be used with any of the materials, and a black single point Indian ink marker, artist marker. So essentially, this is what we've got to work with. And we'll move that out of the way. And now I wanted to mention something about the paper. These materials will work a lot better if you have a decent to good quality paper. You don't want to use jet print paper or something like that, because the paper is the foundation of what you're going to be doing. And like the same thing in building, you don't want to, spend a lot of time and effort building something with a poor foundation. So it's really important that you use a paper that is of a good quality, a good fine art quality. You don't have to necessarily get the most expensive paper, but you should get, a very serviceable paper in use with these materials, and you'll get much better results. Okay, so we'll start with the graphite. And these are the four pencils that you'll get. It's an HB, a 2B, a 4B, and a 6B. The 2B reminds me of Hamlet, to be or not to be. So the way that the pencils are constructed, of course, one of the most important things is the actual lead. And it's not lead, it is graphite, but it's often referred to as lead because it looks like it could be lead, right? So essentially what happens is that in making these leads, you start off with clay, it's a high quality clay, and powdered graphite. Let's see if I can get this open. Well, just here we are. So this is just, I'm making a total mess here. So anyhow, they get a chunk of graphite, which is something that is mined, and then they powder it. So, you can kind of see how nice and rich and black the graphite is just by looking at that. And so, as I mentioned, the HB, the 2B, the 4B, the 6B, those are a way of determining how soft or how hard the leads in the pencils are. Try to kind of get that out of the way a little bit so it doesn't get on everything. So what happens is that when they take the powdered clay and mix it with the powdered graphite, they add water to it, they make kind of a paste out of it, and then they extrude the leads. Okay, now these leads, they start off with California cedar, or for the high-end pencils, and the pencils that we're going to be using, it's not the cedar, but it is the same idea that you start with a blank of wood, and then they put grooves in it, and then the lead fits into those grooves. So here's a section that has all the grooves. Now, what's really important to mention is that all of the pencils that Faber-Castell makes has an SV bonding. And what that means is that when these leads are placed in the wooden slats, they are glued along the whole edge. So every bit of that graphite has been glued into the wooden slats. And what happens with pencils, a lot of pencils are spot glued. So maybe there'd be a little bit of glue here, a little bit of glue there, a little bit of glue there. And what that sets up is a situation where you lose a lot of the lead if you drop your pencil and the lead breaks somewhere in between the glue spots. You're going to lose all the lead in there because it's not keeping it adhered to the wooden structure. So when you go to sharpen the pencil, you might keep on getting the graphite to either fall out or it keeps on breaking. So the advantage of the SV bonding system that Faber-Castell uses, the entire length is glued. So if you do accidentally drop your pencil and you get a little break in the graphite, it's going to be a totally minimum effect. So they make a sandwich. And so you can kind of see the leads are up here at the top, and then they mill them down to be the pencils, and then they finish them off with the paint and all that kind of stuff. So that's the way that they generally make pencils. And again, that SV bonding is really important because it'll extend the life of the pencil, whereas if it were spot glued, then you'd be losing lead all over the place. All right, now, as far as the mixture between the graphite and the clay, if you have a higher proportion of the clay to graphite, it'll make it a harder pencil. And those are determined by the letter H. So if you have a 2H pencil, that means that it is a fairly hard pencil. And then when you get into the softer, if you start decreasing the proportion between the graphite and the clay, or the clay to the graphite, if you have more graphite than you have clay, then that is a softer pencil. So in the range that we have an HB, which is, somewhere kind of in between being hard and soft. Then we have a 2B, and that's going to be a little bit softer. And then we've got a 4B, which is going to be even softer. And then we have the 6B, and of these pencils, that is going to be the softest because it has more graphite relative to the clay. So when they bake all this stuff together, they brand the pencils so you can tell whether you have a moderately hard pencil, a soft pencil, a very soft pencil, or an extremely soft pencil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of, in order to show things up a little bit better, we're going to get rid of the graphite spill here. All right, now the other thing I wanted to mention too is that with your kit, you'll get a handheld pencil sharpener. And so you want to use a handheld sharpener rather than use like an automatic or an office pencil. Because if you think about the use of like a standard 2 pencil that's used for accounting or for writing letters or something like that, it's a fairly hard lead. And so that when you use a commercial sharpener or like a electric one or an office sharpener or something like that, it'll give you a very sharp point, and the distance from the top to the base of it is quite a bit longer than the width across, or the diameter of the lead. Now that's great for a very hard pencil and you can keep a nice sharp point, but if you have an art pencil they generally are a lot softer and they're a little bit more vulnerable to pressure. So if you have a pencil point like that on an art pencil, there's a good chance that the first time you go to draw, you're going to break the point off and it's going to go flying across the room or something like that. So with a handheld sharpener, it will give you a point that is going to be a little blunter. All right, so then the height of your point compared to the base or the diameter, it's a little bit closer. It isn't as extreme as that. Now you might have to sharpen your pencil a little bit more than you would with one of these things, but you won't be breaking the point off the way that you would if it was that sharp. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. You get a much better use of your pencil. You'll break the point much less if you use a handheld sharpener as opposed to sharpening it in, like an office type thing. All right, we're going to start with, my pencils are already sharp. So we're going to start, this is the HB. So this is the one that's somewhere in between. It's like right in the middle. And so when I draw with pencils, I don't hold it down at the base like this, like I'm going to write somebody a letter. I'm going to hold it a little bit farther away from the tip, and that gives me a lot more control. If I can put very light marks down, or if I increase the pressure, I can get a dark mark and so forth, so that you have a lot more control about how much graphite you're laying down on the paper if you hold it farther away from the tip. If you hold it like this, then you're also kind of limited to what kind of lines you can make. That's about as big a line as I can make if I'm holding it like I'm writing a letter. But in through here, if I hold it like that, I can make a little line or I can make a much bigger line. So it just gives you a lot more possibilities of gestures and directions and sizes and whatnot if you have a different grip for holding the pencil when you're doing artwork. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just holding it, letting it pretty much just the weight of the pencil. And I'm going to gradually start putting graphite down on my paper. I'm going to go over it and over. Now, what I'm doing also is with the lighter pressure, the more times I go over the surface of the paper, the darker it's going to get. But because this is an HB and it's a fairly hard pencil, I'll get to a point where it's going to be as dark as it's going to get. Now, if I want to, I can carry that out a little bit and use just a little less pressure as I go to my right. And you can see how it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. I'm going to come back here and maybe get a more gradual blend. So this has kind of a range of going from a very, very light gray to a medium gray. So that's the HB. Now let's see what happens. I got to sharpen my 2B here, my Hamlet pencil. Okay, so this is the 2B. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to kind of hold it. What I usually do is kind of put it up against I've got paws rather than hands. So these are not sausages, they're my fingers. So, but I kind of have it based up against that part of my hand in between these two fingers, put my thumb, and then that really gives me a lot of control. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start off with a little light pressure. And the other advantage of doing this too is you can see the grain of the paper. I like the idea that I can get all my tones, but I don't want to press down so hard that I start destroying the surface of the paper. Because that way, if I have to erase something, or if I want to make corrections, it's harder if you scarred up the paper because you were, kind of holding it and really bearing down on it. Now that would be a hard thing to kind of erase, and it would look a lot different than maybe over and through here because this has no texture. I've pushed the paper and flattened it all the way down so I don't get the grain of the paper come through, and that you can use to your advantage. And we'll go over those kind of, the reasons that you do certain things for part 2 when we're actually be working on a drawing. All right, so I'm kind of at a point again where that's about as dark as I can get it with just this one pencil by going over and over without too much pressure. But you can see that there is a big difference then between how dark I can get with an HB and the 2B. And of course, if I lighten up on the pressure, then I can also get a lighter gray. And that's mainly with less graphite on the paper, you actually have the white of the paper coming through, and that's what kind of gives it that tone. It's a combination of the color of your paper and the value of the paper, or the brightness of the color of the paper, in conjunction with how much graphite you're putting down on top of it. All right, that's the 2B. Now let's go to the 4B. Okay. So this one, I hardly have to use any pressure at all, and it's already about as dark as that is. So and if you have your materials, you could, kind of follow along and just experiment to see what kind of control you can get. And a lot of this is just if you practice and you experiment and try things out, then you'll get to be quite adept at handling your pencils. Okay. That's the 4B. And then the 6B is the softest. And so already, again, I'm just using very light pressure, and I'm almost up to that. So if I compare this value with this value, there's quite a difference, but because these are a little closer in the softness, like there's only like a 4B and a 6B is a 2 jump, 2B to 4B is 2 jump and stuff. But from the HB to the 6B, that's 4 times, softer. Yeah, so now, now that's essentially the story on the graphite. And what you do with it is going to be up to you, deciding, whether you want to do something that's more abstract, if you want to do something that's a little bit more rendered, and we'll be getting into that. But as an adjunct thing, material to use with the pencils, there's the eraser. It's a vinyl eraser. And if I come back, let's go with the 4B. If I go ahead and put down some value on the paper, this is an additive process. I'm adding graphite particles to the surface of my paper. Right. So having put a ground down here, then I could actually draw or make lines or do things with my eraser. So erasers aren't necessarily just because you've made some kind of mistake. You can actually use it as a way to get marks, get textures. I can kind of come across. And again, I really encourage you to experiment with your materials to begin with, so you start getting a certain awareness of what they're capable of doing. You can either take a brush, or this is just a spare rag, and I can get most of those eraser bits off without doing too much smudging, and then you can come back and rework that and decide, okay, well, let's do this or whatever it is that you'd like to do. Now, you might also consider at some point, once you get accustomed to the materials in your kits, this is a kneaded eraser. And Faber-Castell makes very nice kneaded erasers. It's called kneaded erasers because that's what you do. Once you get some graphite in it, if you knead it, like you're making sourdough bread or something like that, then magically the graphite seems to disappear. Now, the advantage with a kneaded eraser is that if I have a tone down here, right, here's our 4 again. I'll very quickly put some more value down here. The kneaded eraser is just a tiny bit sticky. And so for this, instead of bearing down like I did with the vinyl eraser to get a really clean, distinct line, you can use this to modify the surface area. And if I just kind of press that lightly, I can start gradually making it lighter and lighter and lighter. So, that's not quite as abrupt and clean as with the vinyl eraser. So these vinyl erasers are really good for kind of more major alterations, whether it's to correct a mistake or whether it's to give it an effect. But with a kneaded eraser, it's just much softer. And if you want to, you can actually use it to alter a value over the whole surface by just kind of picking it up and pressing it down and so forth. So once you get kind of used to the materials in the kit, you might decide that you could pick up a kneaded eraser as well. Okay, so now as far as the way that you draw with it, if I were doing something like now, most technical drawings are done on the computer, but they used to all be done by drafts people that used pencils or used pen and ink. But if you have a very precise drawing that you want to do, and you're going to be using a ruler, straight edge, something like that, and the whole incentive is to make lines that look pretty much the same from start to finish, then you'll use the harder pencil, like the HB. They also make 2 H's, 4 H's, 6 H's, so they get even harder. But just with very little pressure, I'll just, go along the edge and I can get a straight line. And so this has a specific static quality to it. It just goes from here to there, and it's pretty much the same from here to there. With the softer pencils, like my favorite is the 6B. I mean, I kind of actually like to wallow in graphite. And so that if you are using this pencil, like a real soft pencil, and instead of trying to get a real precise, very mechanical looking line, usually if you want something a little bit more organic, a little bit more fluid, then you'd use a softer one. And the 6B, you can make light lines with it, you can put in light tones with it, but you can also get very nice looking lines. And so if I want to just very quickly do kind of a quick little pig drawing here, this pencil is very responsive to the gestures that I'm making or the way that I'm moving my hand. And so when you look at it, it's much more dynamic. It goes from being thick when I put a little more pressure, and then as I come around maybe a curve, I lighten up and then it disappears. So this has a visual quality or a visual image that is so much different than if I were doing the same thing with a straight line and a hard edge. So this is very consistent. It's very static, but these kind of lines go from thick to thin to thick to thin, so that when you're drawing something that's a little bit more organic, for instance, like, if I want to kind of put a shoulder in here, if I just press it and then start lifting up as I draw it, it goes from thin to thick. And so it gives you more of a feeling for a rounded organic shape. And then once you get a key drawing in there, you don't always have to start with line, or if you want to, let's say that you want to do something that maybe isn't quite as linear to begin with, I'll go back to my HB pencil and very lightly, I can kind of sketch something in. I'll do kind of a similar little character here. I can make him smile here. So I have less emphasis here on line just because I'm not using very much pressure with a harder pencil. So here I've got another one that you probably could just barely see, but trust me, it's there. And then I can go back and start adding some value to it. So I can kind of think about, even though this is like a little character that comes out of my head, I can kind of imagine that maybe the light's coming this way. So anything that is away from the light is going to be more in shadows. So I can develop an entire character without necessarily having an outline. I can just use the shading with the graphite And if I want it to be light, I use very little pressure. And if I have areas that are going to be in kind of shadow, or I want to get a little emphasis to it, I can make them a little bit darker. So in this case, the emphasis is not on line, it's more on the shading and the way that I am developing the form with the value in terms of, light to dark, dark shading, light shading. This trotter is going to be the darkest, probably with a little bit of a highlight. Okay, so I've got my character that isn't quite as linear as that. And if I want to put a little emphasis here and there, I could do that. I can use very light, and then for that kind of organic curve there, I could make it a little thicker and then just taper it off. So this has a lot more energy to it than if I would take my pencil and then just make a consistent line. Now, neither one of these techniques is necessarily right or wrong. It kind of depends on what it is that you want to do with your drawing. And the best thing to do, especially if you're, just beginning, just practice and try different techniques and see, okay, what is the difference between drawing lines that are pretty much the same thickness, the same darkness, and I'm very slow in drawing them. What does that look like? Feel there. Compared to doing the same type of thing very quickly and a little bit more gesturally and without necessarily having total outlines, but just putting in some emphasis points where you need them and then come back and put in some value. So these are just, a couple of little exercise or some things you can experiment with to find out what the graphite is about. I mean, it's a lot different than, your #2 school pencil, where you pretty much just use that for your handwriting. Dear whoever, dear Jim. That has different quality to it than the kind of lines that you might use to draw with. You can combine the two effects. I mean, it's going to be pretty much up to you to kind of explore and find out what is going to work for you. All right, so as we go through, if you have any questions, just pose them in the chat room, and then I will be alerted, and I can answer your questions as I continue to draw and demonstrate. So feel free if there's anything that you need amplification on, or if you're not clear about something, don't be shy and go ahead and ask questions. All right, the next thing that I thought we'd go to is your Pitt pen. All right. Essentially what this is, it's a single point. Let's see if I can get it close enough here. Let's go that way and then go that way. I'm trying to do everything backwards by my screen. All right, but you can see that's a fairly small point. All right, and the formulation of the ink in the Pitt pens, it's like Indie ink, but they have been able to alter it so that it doesn't dry up immediately in the pen, but it essentially has kind of very similar look to it. And so it has a very single width. Now, depending on the way that you use it, if I do it very quickly with very light pressure, then that's going to look a lot different, that line. Maybe I can hold it up a little bit closer so you can see. There you go. Okay, so it isn't as dark, it isn't as thick, even though it is a single line. But if you wanted to, I mean, you could, get like a little template here, so I could make a circle here. And so that looks very much like a geometric shape. It's a flat kind of circle. Now, if I take the same pen and I kind of draw with very little pressure and then make it a little bit darker as it comes around and then come back with a little less pressure and maybe let that line break up a little bit, then you can kind of see this as being something a little bit more organic and not quite as mechanical as that. So again, even something as simple as a very fixed width point to give you a very specific line, depending on how much pressure, the way that you hold the pen, you can get some additional effects. Now, I thought it'd be interesting, just as an aside, these are the old-fashioned dip pens, and these are the pens that people used forever until the invention of the fountain pen, which I believe was like at the end of the 19th century, maybe the beginning of the 20th century. But you can get a whole variety of tips. There are a bunch of these vintage pen points that you can get out there, but what reason I'm even bringing it up is I want to make the comparison between the two, which I think is important. So this is the Indie ink. It's carbon black in lacquer, shellac, and call them dip points because you dip them in there. Now, the thing about this type of pen, I could get, a standard black line with it. But what's so nice about these dip pens is that depending on how you work with them, you get a completely different line quality. And so if I do like, one of my real quick little characters again.
As you're drawing your character, we do have a question.
Yes.
On a suggestion of a good brand for the dip pens.
Oh, the dip pens, there's Gillette, Speedball's been around forever. The pen points that I love are were no longer made, but they were made as a front that in I don't know, early 20th century, England was very interested in spying on Russia, and they had a pen point that was favored by the Russians because of Cyrillic printing. And so they had this fake pen company where they made these pen points and they sent the salesman into Russia. And effectively, in effect, they were sending English spies in the guise of a pen point salesman to spy on. All right, so that's the kind of quality. Now, what I love is that, and here, like this is kind of like an example of this my sketchbook here. And so I love doing a lot of drawings and then I'll add color to them. And so line work is very important aspect of what I'm doing. But if I have a sketchbook and I'm on an airplane, I'm not going to be taking Indie ink and dip pens. They probably would confiscate them anyhow as a dangerous weapon or who knows what. And that's why I love these Pitt pens, because I can pretty much do the same type of work with these pens as I can with the dip pens. Now, especially, with the S point, all right, I'll come back. And again, just the gesture. So this is going to be a different look if I just do it with a certain fluid motion, and just naturally, even though it's a fixed point, it goes from thick to thin. And then once, let me just very quickly kind of do this one here. I like to stay with the same thing. This guy looks he's a little angry. I don't know what about. It's a nice day. Okay. So if I want to make something a little bit darker, I can either go over it again. And then again, this is not included in the actual kit, but you can also get a variety of points in the Pitt pen range. So this one is an FH, and it's almost exactly like a dip pen. So again, once you get accustomed to the materials that are in the beginning kit, you might want to expand and experiment and see how you can add to your arsenal of things. But this pen, the point on it is very similar to a dip pen. I mean, it's just, you can see that, maybe I'll draw a little bit larger, but you can see that the quality of that, it goes from thin to thick. And then I can get nice thick lines with it. I can get very thin lines with it. So again, depending on how the gesture that you use, the force, how much, and it takes a while to get used to doing that type of thing, but that comes through you practicing. So start off with your S point, and if you're so interested in checking out some of the other points, they have a medium point, they have a fine point, they have the FH, which gives you a more fluid line. And then once I have the main figure done, then you can come in and you can do what's called cross hatching. So I'll just do an example here that if you do a similar line and you keep everything kind of parallel, your eye will start blending that together. And you'll see that as a tone. All right, if I want to make part of it darker, I can go cross grain. And so that grid pattern is going to get the eye to look at that as being even darker. And the more of these series of the lines that you put down, the darker it's going to look. And obviously, if you really saturate an area, it's going to be very dark. Okay, so you can build up a whole kind of value system just by how much you're using with this. Now, the other thing that you can do is use this kind of cross hatching to kind of help give extra form to whatever it is that you're drawing. And, you know, if you think about, if you would take a dollar bill out of your wallet, let's say, or your purse, and you look at it, essentially, all those tones are created by engraved lines that are just a series of lines. The closer together they are, the more dense, the darker it looks, but it's all printed in black ink. And, you know, there isn't any really kind of fussing around with the value. It's more getting your eye to blend everything together, look like different grays and different shades just by the form. Now, if we go back to this kind of circular idea, if let's say I'm going to do a cylinder of some kind, and I want to kind of make that a little bit darker, then when I'm making the lines down at the bottom here, and then I'll keep these really close together. And I'll follow the form going across this way. And as I come up around it, I'm going to use fewer lines, and then maybe I'll come back here again and get these a little bit closer together and pile on top of each other. So now that looks a little bit more rounded. It's definitely darker here. You know, I could really kind of come back and put quite a bit of ink down here for a shadow to really kind of pull it away from that. You can do that. Now, the other thing, if you wanted to add some more shading to get, you know, further sense of the roundness of that, instead of doing this type of pattern, which is more like a grid, which is going to flatten it, I'm going to follow the curve with my cross hatching. So I'm going to make curved lines that will describe the surface of the cylinder a lot better than if I use straight lines. If I use straight lines, it would flatten it. If I use rounded strokes with this pen on a rounded surface, then it's going to help convince you that this is a rounded object. And then, of course, as I kind of showed in my sketchbook, once I get the ink work done, then I could use my colored pencils, I could use watercolor, I could use something like that, because like India ink, the ink formulation in these Pitt pens are permanent. So at first they're liquid, you can move them around a little bit. You can actually just lick my finger, and I just am lightly going over it so I can kind of get the ink to be a little more fluid. But once the ink dries, it's permanent. So, and also, I had mentioned something about the paper before. Good paper has sizing in it. And what the sizing does, it's something that they either put on the surface or they put in the blend when they're making the paper. The sizing protects the fibers of the paper from absorbing the pigment too quickly or too extensively. So if I want to correct, or if I want to redo something, it's a lot easier to do with paper that is sized. So even though this is a permanent black ink, if I can get it before it dries and becomes permanent, the sizing of the paper will help with that. It keeps it from the paper fibers from immediately absorbing the pigment. It just kind of it's a gradual process. Then you have time with a brush and some water. You can make kind of some nice gray tones after you've added this thing to it. But if you wait too long, or if you're using paper that doesn't have sizing, then you really don't have that as an option. But it doesn't make any difference. Maybe it isn't anything that would be that significant to you to begin with. All right, so that is the Pit pen. And to expand the range, there are a whole different range of the points. This one is an XS, so it's even smaller than the S point. So if I want to put in even finer detail, then I can use this pen. So these are things to think about adding to your collection in the future, because you might find that it'll expand the range of things that you can do. But for the most part, I use either my FH pen, or most regularly, I use the S point. And again, if I'm on an airplane, I've got my pen, I've got some pencils or something like that, my sketchbook, and I can entertain myself the whole flight without having to worry about getting in the ink all over the place and get all over my hands and stuff like that. So it's a good thing to have either for sketching or for doing actual finished drawings. All right, the next material I'd like to get to are the color pencils. And these are gold Faber pencils. And what they are, part of the creative studio line. And at one point, they did have like a student grade, or they had a beginner grade and stuff. And they're very high quality. They work great, but they wanted to try to get a higher quality even for beginners, because I agree with this. I think that you learn a lot faster and you'll understand a little bit more about your technique if you're using really high quality materials. Because if something doesn't look right, it could simply be because you're using bad materials and you're doing everything right, but it's just impossible to get something with bad materials. But these will open the door to your creativity because they do what they're supposed to do and they're really nice to use. All right, so these pencils come in a range of 48 colors altogether. You'll get these 6 in your packet here. And if we take out the yellow, and this is almost like a cyan color and kind of a reddish magenta color, these are kind of like the primaries that will enable you to overlap the colors so you can get other colors as well. But it's also nice to have the real, a purple. So instead of trying to make a purple with 2 pencils, you get in one pencil. But, this range of colors is something that will really get you off to a good start.
Just
Now,
a friendly reminder, we have 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. So 15 minutes, I'll speed it up here a little bit. Each one of these pencils has a number, 121, this is 147. All of the pigments that Faber-Castell used, whether it's a pastel, a pencil, watercolor pencil, a drawing marker, all use the same pigment. So if you're doing some kind of multimedia thing, if you have a 121 color pencil, you have a 121 color marker, you have a 121 pastel, whatever, those pigments are the same, so you can put them together without them having any kind of a conflict. Now, very similar to the graphite pencils, they have the SV bonding, so they're glued along the whole way so that when you sharpen the pencil, you're not going to have the lead keep on falling out. And the other thing that is really nice about these color pencils is that they are oil-based rather than wax-based. So that means that as I'm drawing, let's go with the red here, and the same kind of pencil holding techniques, maybe hold it a little farther from the point, and you'll have a lot more control over it. All right, so I'm going to start to make it a little bit darker, and then I'm going to come a little bit lighter here. Now I'm gonna really start to use a little, and these are so soft. I mean, they're really nice and creamy feeling. They go on very easily, so you don't have to use a lot of pressure. But all right, so we've got this nice kind of red construct there. All right, so let's try putting a little yellow on top of that. And you can see the way that that really warms that up. Start to kind of take it to an orange tone. And then maybe over here, I'll just put the straight yellow. So you can get really nice visual effects so that this is going to look like this yellow has overlapped the red, or maybe the red has overlapped the yellow. I mean, you can kind of play around with different effects. All right, so let's put a blue on top of that. Now, the reason I'm layering all this is to show you the possibilities of what happens when you start building areas, color areas up with one layer and then the other. Now, if you were using wax-based pencils, you'd start getting into a little bit of trouble because there's only so much wax that you can layer on top of another layer of wax. And instead of putting more down, it actually starts to chip away and it starts lifting off the paper. With oil-based pencils, you just can layer and layer and layer and layer, and you'll always be able to put another color down on top of it. So, you know, that green on top of the yellow is going to produce a brighter green. You know, on top of the red, it's going to kind of, they're complementary colors, so that's going to be kind of a neutral tone that results after that. Put the purple down on top of like the yellow, the same thing is going to happen. It's not going to be as vibrant as the purple that's on the raw white paper. All right, so you've got just a whole bunch of possibilities of different ways of kind of doing the color. And I thought, you know, a couple tricks. I mean, if you wanted to do something that has kind of a nice straight edge, but you don't want to draw a line, you can hold your straight edge down. And then maybe as I go to the right, I'm gonna make it a little bit darker or dense, and then you keep that there at the same place, maybe pick up here, overlap it a little bit. So I've made kind of like a little triangle there. I'm gonna take this blue now, and then I'm gonna go kind of at the bottom, make a little bit darker, and then leave a little bit of white here and there, and then I'm gonna go on top of that just a little bit. Okay, so then I can take the yellow and maybe go just a little bit lighter, just so there's a little bit of a hint. So I had this idea, I was just messing around with it, and it started to look a little bit like some kind of abstract sailboat that's in the water or something. And so you can get, you know, start kind of playing around with techniques or ways that you can put little light bits of pigment down and then stronger bits. And maybe come back with some, so just experiment to see what happens when you layer, try making some specific shapes, maybe think of some kind of a scene, experiment with it. So at the end of it, you know, it's going to look a little bit like something sticking out of the water, and then you get a little bit of reflection. So you can overlap them, you can get specific shapes, and kind of like a ribbon shape there. And if I go over on top of that with a red, then where they overlap, it's going to be like something's overlapped. And if I want to make it look more like the red's on top, then if I come back and maybe put a little bit of a shadow here and here, kind of helps push that down because of the shadow and brings that up. And especially if I can kind of come back and maybe make that a little bit brighter and a little more intense. So play with the pencils, you can draw with them, you know, similar, you know, instead of using graphite, I could draw my little pig here with And again, if you're somewhat energetic with the way that you're drawing, then you're going to get thick lines, thin lines. If you want to sketch something out before you do it, you can use lighter pressure. You can start kind of developing the form, think about where the light would be, where the shadows are, and things like that. So there's quite a bit that you can do with the pencils themselves, with the color pencils. And then if you can combine them, for instance, I won't take any more time if we have to, but this is one I was kind of playing with before we started, and I started off with a black drawing with the S Pen, and then added colors to it, and then kind of build up like the little kind of huffy face there with the red on top of the orange. And once you start playing around with these things, they are tremendous, a lot of fun and very satisfying to experiment and see what you come up with. Now, our last category are pastels, and rather than work with the white paper with the pastels, I thought they would show up a little bit better with the black. Okay, so these come in 24 colors. You get half of them with your kit. Okay, and then the way that you can use them, all right, you have three basic ways that you can think about this shape of a pastel. If you put it on one of the corners, you can actually draw lines with them. And again, depending on how much energy, don't think of these as another pencil. This is a different material. And so these can do certain things. They're really good for surfaces. You can get detail with them, but don't rely on these 100% for the line quality. They're much better to be used for surfaces and whatnot. Okay, but part of it too is if you want to start sketching something very lightly, you can do that. So that maybe we'll do a real quick little apple or something like that. So if I want to start getting a sense for the form, I don't have to get it right off. I don't have to get the perfect line, but I can kind of indicate with these sketchy lines where the outline is, or what the general shape is. Okay, so I've been able to kind of sketch that. Now, the other thing you can do is use them up against an edge. So instead of having a line, you have a line, I guess, but it's thicker. All right, so you can use that, or you can use the long edge of it for that type of thing. All right, so what I generally will do, if I have it sketched out, then I'll start thinking, okay, I'm going to start getting the surface. And again, instead of going just up and down and totally trying to fill it, I like keeping some of that texture. And then over here, if the light is coming in from this direction and this side's going to be a little bit darker, so I'll use just the weight of the thing itself, and I can get okay. So there's the beginning of it. Now, if I want to make it a little brighter, I can use a little more pressure and get that. That'll get it to pop up. I come in here, maybe just on this edge, a little bit of light that is kind of flowing around, and down here where it's a little reflective right there. Up here, if I want to kind of get a sense of, now usually where the stem is, it's down in this little kind of recess. And I want to get a highlight right on the edge. So you can experiment with just the way that you're applying them. Are you going to use this to sketch with, or if you want like a really nice edge, you could do that. To get a little more detail, maybe I'll go with using this edge up and through here, just a little more value. Now, the other thing you can do, you can blend the colors, and I can do that with my finger. This is going to get rid of some of the texture. I don't want to get rid of all of it, but I might want to get, kind of a sense that it's a little smoother, shinier surface. So it's not like necessarily and then I can start blending things together to get a feeling for the form itself. And since this apple is round, then instead of going back and forth like that and trying to get a consistently solid, what I'm doing is kind of just very lightly. It's almost like I'm caressing the apple, like I'm just kind of going over, pretending it's a real apple. And so this is rounded, so I'm going to round it off like that. Then you can also add on top of it, yeah, a lot of apples are kind of just more than just red. So I can very lightly start adding a little bit of another color, very gently, maybe working that in a bit. Okay, and when you come to thinking about maybe a couple little highlights, then you just use very light touch there. Or, you know, if you really have part of it here that is going to be very bright, and then you can kind of work that back in.
This is your 2-minute warning, and
Sure.
anybody in the chat, if you have any questions, we are open to taking them.
Okay, so you can also blend colors together. As I finish up here, we might go just a couple minutes over. You know, I can get a really nice orange. I can take, let's say this blue, then add a yellow on top of it. Let's go across this way. So I get that really kind of nice green color. And a lot of times too, I kind of like, you can apply it with just like these little kind of tiny little strokes and then come back and just kind of break that up a little bit. So you get just a bit of that kind of surface of an apple that has little kind of almost like pock marks or something. You can also use a paper stomp. Now these a lot of times will take quite a bit of the pigment off, but you can get maybe a little more refinement with your blending with one of these things. But I kind of like the idea of trying not to over blend. You know, you don't want the entire surface to be exactly the same. You would be nice to be able to kind of keep a certain amount of texture still. Put our little stem on that to make it a little bit so it shows up a little bit more. I'm going to put a just slight highlight on it, maybe a little highlights here at the tops. Okay. So, any questions? All right, so we have graphite. We did the graphite. We explored the color pencils, what you can do with those. We got the pastels. We've got the black pit pen. We've got, you know, erasers. Oh, the other thing about the need eraser, especially on these, I mean, the vinyl eraser is good, but if you want to do something that is very subtle, let's say I want to get this a little bit darker down here, this is really good for pastel work. You can get some nice little shadows, very subtle shadows by just kind of stomping into it. As far as fixing it, I've had that question a lot of times when I've done my pastels. I build up such subtle little areas in places that if I use a fixative on it, no matter how careful I am, it always kind of blends a few things together. I lose some of my detail. So I have a tendency not to put fixative on my soft pastels, but instead what I do is immediately put them in a mat, so that with a window mat, it kind of protects anything from accidentally rubbing the surface. So I'm kind of not everybody's like this. but I have a tendency to like to keep the pastels unfixed with it and kind of spray fix it. All right. So if you have no questions, then that's what we have for today's session. And the next session, we'll actually be doing a project with these materials so you can kind of follow step by step, and it'll kind of help you be able to put some of these things together. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining today. And I hope you have fun experimenting with your materials. Again, I can't say enough about the quality of these materials. It just makes it so much more enjoyable to use really good materials. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.